Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the material you share with us, the articles, clips, research, and really dig in to pull out the key insights.
Yeah, get under the surface a bit.
Exactly. So today we're diving into a set of sources you sent over that, well, they offer a pretty critical look at parts of Brazilian media, the justice system, and some major political figures.
And it's important to say up front, right, that this material is definitely politically charged. It comes from a very specific viewpoint.
Absolutely crucial point. Our goal here isn't to agree or disagree, not to take sides at all. We're just here to unpack what these sources are actually saying.
We're laying out their arguments, the examples they use, the claims they make, strictly sticking to the material you gave us.
Right. So you can understand the perspective presented in these sources. Okay, let's get into it. The first big theme seems to be media scrutiny. Yeah.
Definitely. The sources really put journalist Daniela Lima from Globo News under the microscope, specifically her relationship, or what the sources see as her relationship with the judiciary.
And they pinpoint a specific moment.
They do. A key piece of evidence for them is this clip they show. It's Daniela Lima on air, and she's reading messages, apparently exchanged with a Supreme Court minister.
Reading them out loud?
Yeah. She describes texting this minister about Congresswoman Carla Zambelli. The source quotes her saying something like, "Zambelli fled, minister." Apparently she laughs while recounting this.
Okay. And how do the sources interpret that? I imagine they have a strong take.
Oh, absolutely. They flat out reject it as journalism. The source literally asks, is this journalism? Their answer is clearly no. They label it snitching.
Snitching? Wow.
Yeah. And they build on that. They argue she's not acting independently, but more like a, quote, spokesperson for what they term a regime or a state of exception.
So the claim is she's funneling information.
That's what the source alleges, yeah. That her role, as they frame it, is gathering info for ministers.
And then there's this censorship claim tied to the same incident.
Right. The sources suggest that this specific segment, where she read the messages, was actually cut out of the recording on Globoplay, Globo's streaming platform.
How do they show that?
They point to the video timeline in the material they provide. There's apparently a jump. It goes from 23 minutes, 28 seconds straight to 23 minutes, 30 seconds, skipping right over that exchange.
And the implication is?
The sources basically ask, did the judge not like it? Implying, that maybe there was pressure from the judiciary to remove that specific part.
Okay, so they present that alleged edit as kind of reinforcing their argument about improper connections.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. They bring in other examples related to the Carla Zambelli case to criticize media reporting more broadly.
Like what?
Well, there was the whole situation when Zambelli was reportedly flying to Italy. Media reports, highlighted by the sources, suggested she might be arrested there, that Brazilian police knew but somehow missed her.
And the source found that illogical.
Yeah, contradictory. They ask how Brazilian police could just, quote, materialize in Italy for an arrest. And they note a journalist later had to clarify extradition rules, needing a location first. The source basically uses this reporting confusion as ammunition.
And wasn't there something about passport seizures, too?
Yes, that's another big one for the sources. They say Daniela Lima stated on air that passport seizures were becoming a general rule based on some understanding in the Supreme Court.
And the source questions how she'd know that.
Exactly. They jump on that. How could she know the court's internal understanding? Again, the implication from the source is improper direct contact with judges. Further evidence, in their view, of her being a spokesperson.
The language the sources use gets pretty strong here, right? They use the word terrorism.
They do. But it's important we clarify how they define it in this context. It's not about violence. For them, it's media spreading fear and disinformation. That's the terrorism they're alleging.
Can you give an example of that?
A key one they use involves reporting on Zambelli's Interpol status. The sources show one media report stating with certainty, citing a blog, that Zambelli was on the Interpol red list requested by Minister Moraes. It says it's confirmed.
Okay.
But then the source immediately cuts to a clip from a different channel. And in that clip, someone is shown actively checking the official Interpol website right then and there. And there's no entry for Carla Zambelli at that specific moment.
Ah. So the source presents that as direct proof of misleading reporting by some outlets.
Precisely. That side-by-side comparison is powerful evidence for the source's argument. The main takeaway they seem to be pushing is that figures like Lima aren't neutral journalists. They're painted as part of this engine or regime working against democracy based on these specific examples.
Right. And that whole discussion about media and alleged connections, it really seems to set the stage for another huge theme in the sources you sent, this idea of a double standard.
A major one. Runs through pretty much everything. A perceived double standard in the justice system and in media coverage, especially around political speech.
How do they illustrate that?
They draw a really stark contrast. They put comedian Léo Lins side by side with President Lula. Lins, they state, was convicted for telling jokes in a theater.
Okay. And Lula?
And Lula, according to the sources, has made numerous public statements, widely reported statements that the sources find highly offensive, inappropriate, yet they point out he faces zero legal consequences.
And they provide examples of these statements.
Oh, yes. A whole collection pulled from clips within the source material. They group them into categories.
Such as?
Well, there are comments the sources connect to domestic violence, like a joke about a Corinthians fan or saying if you hit a woman, do it somewhere else, not at home.
Okay. What else?
Statements about race and slavery that they deem offensive. Things like thanking Africa for slavery in Brazil, comments on Afro-descendants and drums, or calling the racial mixture the good thing about bringing black people over.
Any other categories?
Yeah, comments seen as ableist jokes about walkers or crutches, people with mental health issues having a screw loose. Also, what they see is fat shaming, like jokes about Flavio Dino's eating. And one comment flagged as homophobic, calling a city an exporter of queers.
And the sources stress these were public statements.
Repeatedly. Made by the president, sometimes on a global stage. And they slam that right up against the legal trouble faced by a comedian for jokes in a, private venue.
So the core point the source is making is, it's about who's talking.
Exactly. The source's insight seems to be that the exact same words could land one person in serious trouble while being completely ignored, legally speaking, when said by someone else, especially someone in power.
And there's another source that reinforces this, with a video.
Yeah, the Roni Gabriel video mentioned in the material, it lists many of these Lula quotes and just flat out argues any comedian saying this stuff would face jail time, serious jail time.
So it really hammers home that source's perspective.
It does. The video explicitly says, according to the source material, it's not what is said, but who is saying it. The implication being a kind of protected status for some.
And they tie this back to Carla Zambelli's situation, too.
They do. The sources recount her status. Conviction upheld by the Supreme Court, SDF, 10-year prison sentence, lost her mandate, considered a fugitive, reportedly in Italy, on the Interpol list.
And how is that used as evidence for the double standard argument?
The sources emphasize the speed and severity of it all. They contrast it, implicitly or explicitly, with others who faced issues and left the country. They do note her case involves more than just, quote, opinion crimes, suggesting her alleged actions were different. But even so, the sources imply the swiftness, the 10-year sentence, the fugitive status, it all serves as an example, in their view, of this differential treatment.
Oh, and they also briefly mention Bolsonaro's reported reaction to her plight, which is apparently just, I don't know her. Right. Okay, shifting focus a bit. The sources also get into how political figures' images are, well, managed and portrayed and satirized.
Yeah.
Using Lula's Paris trip.
Yeah, that's a case study they use. The source adopts a really sarcastic tone about the whole narrative of Brazil regaining international respect. They use Lula in Paris to poke holes in that, from their perspective.
What specifically do they highlight?
There's the scene at an art exhibition. According to the source, Lula ends up lying on the floor. They describe it as an awkward, sort of acrobatic movement.
Okay.
And the source makes a point of noting that Macron, the French president, seems to be looking away, kind of ignoring it. They also mention a moment where Lula apparently pulls his hand away from Janja. Small details, but they use them.
And how do they use them?
As fodder for satire. They show AI-generated images mocking these moments, Lula as a jester, things like that. Also, stereotypical parodies of left-wing supporters saying radical things. It's using humor as a weapon, really.
And predictably, perhaps, they critique the media coverage of this Paris incident, too.
Of course. This ties back into the double standard theme again. They point to left-leaning outlets, like Metropols, that spun Lula's floor moment positively, saying it showed he was in good physical shape.
And the source contrasts that
with how they claim the same media would have reacted if Bolsonaro had done something similar. They assert it would have been called pathetic, embarrassing Brazil. Clear evidence for the source of media bias and applying different rules depending on who's involved.
Got it. There was also a mention of a parody show, Programa Marisa Mayo.
Yeah, it's included briefly, described in the material as un-PC, funny, tackling sensitive stuff head-on.
Why include that, do you think, based on the source?
It seems like it's presented as a contrast, maybe suggesting here's a space where this kind of edgy humor can still exist, unlike perhaps the mainstream discourse they've been criticizing, a kind of counterpoint to perceived restriction.
Okay, so if we bring all these threads together from the sources you provided, we've looked at their specific claims about media conduct, the alleged judicial links, using those examples like the Daniela Lima messages.
And then the really extensive examples they compiled to argue for this perceived double standard in how different political figures are treated, especially regarding speech and legal consequences.
Right. Contrasting Lula's statements with Léo Lins' conviction and tying in Zambelli's case.
Yeah.
And we saw how satire and media criticism are used within these sources to drive home those points.
And just to reiterate one last time, this whole discussion, everything we've covered, it's drawn solely from the source material you shared with us. We've just tried to lay out the arguments and evidence as presented in those sources.
Absolutely. So based on this deep dive into what these particular sources are saying, here's something to maybe think about. What do these kinds of commentaries, the ones alleging media bias, judicial inconsistencies, different rules for different people's speech, what might they suggest from the perspective of these sources about the state of political debate, media trust, and accountability in Brazil right now?
And maybe also when trust in institutions is being questioned so directly as it is in these sources, what role does that kind of pointed, sometimes harsh political satire they showcase play? Is it just critique or something else? Definitely something to mull over after digging into this material.